Hello everyone, it's Mr. Boff here. We've got a new poem in front of us today. Those of us who are paying attention to the name of the poet will recognise Langston Hughes as the poet of Mother to Son. So if you're in my Year 9 class, you will have actually come across this poet before. Very famous black American poet, part of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s and 1930s, and indeed into the post-war period too. If you're familiar with Mother to Son, you'll be familiar with the way that Langston Hughes uses, explores and exploits metaphor in his poetry. And that's also the case in this poem, Harlem. Now, it's worth bearing in mind, this is actually part of a much longer kind of poetic sequence. It's pretty much book length. This shorter poem, kind of taken from that longer poem, is very, very famous in its own right, particularly that opening line, "What happens to a dream deferred?" It's referenced in all sorts of different ways, quite possibly in Martin Luther King's very famous "I Have a Dream" speech, but also more recently in someone like Killer Mike, the rapper Killer Mike, in one of his songs in his sort of last solo album before he formed Run the Jewels, actually references this specific line and Langston Hughes by name in one of his songs, so in his lyrics. So this poem kind of looms large over black American experience and is intimately tied to that, and yet at the same time can also be read as a sort of broader exploration of the nature of dreams and desires and hopes for a different sort of world, and what can happen when those dreams and desires for some sort of change, when those dreams and desires aren't fulfilled, okay, which is rather interesting. So let's have a read of it. We can have a think of this poem, think carefully about what it may mean, its many different meanings, how it's organised, and some of the very interesting language choices, and of course a really interesting use of metaphorical language. So this is Harlem by Langston Hughes. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? Okay, so lots of different ways of thinking of this particular poem, thinking about what this poem means. Let's think about that opening line. What happens to a dream deferred? So this is a poem that begins by posing a question, one that we, as a reader, will reflect and ruminate upon. So what happens to a dream deferred? A dream unrealised. A dream, to defer means to put something back. A dream not engaged with. A dream ignored. He doesn't say what that dream is. Okay, now we know Langston Hughes, his background when he's writing. Harlem is a very interesting choice. Harlem, a predominantly black area of New York, and that throughout the 20th century there have been a number. If you type in Harlem riots, there are a number of riots across the 20th century that take place in Harlem, often involving white brutality towards black people. Okay, that's often the trigger. Sometimes, and rather pertinent for this current particular movement and moment, thinking of Black Lives Matter, often precipitated these riots by what's perceived to be police brutality. So this is the poem that I think really connects. It's very much like of its time, and also connects to our current contemporary experience, particularly, as I've said, around Black Lives Matter. So what happens to a dream deferred? So the poem is posing this kind of question, this philosophical question. What happens to such a dream? But then, interestingly, chooses a series of extremely physical even visceral images. We have this series of similes. Okay, does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Okay, does the dream dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or does it fester like a sore and then run? And we've got generally rather, if you excuse the pun, revolting images. It is a highly metaphorical poem, but one that's purposefully unpleasant. Drying up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore. So this is this. We've got this line of poetry really generating a degree of disgust, becoming almost like an ulcer. That the dream unrealized, the dream deferred, festers, becomes infected, and runs with what we presume to be pus. So it's deeply unpleasant. And then we've got, does it stink? Again, look at this purposefully disgusting, vulgar, unpleasant language. Does it stink like rotten meat? So you've also got the language of decay, which is very interesting. Does it stink like rotten meat? So when you don't fulfill a dream, does it begin to stink like rotten meat? Or does it crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? But these are all images in their own way of decay, of things becoming decayed and festering and unpleasant. Okay? The opening image is probably the least unpleasant of all of them. Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? But there it's becoming diminished and almost dried out, desiccated, we could say. That these dreams, if they aren't fulfilled, if they aren't allowed to kind of flower into and be fully realised, that we've got either these images of desiccation, of drying up, or even of decay, this festering sore, okay, or crusting over like a syrupy sweet, which is interesting. Interesting use of the parallel structure. Does it? Okay. This has a technical name, but what's interesting is we're posed these questions. It poses lots of questions. It's a poem, I think, that encourages reflection, but it's also, I would suggest, challenging, intentionally challenging, even possibly confrontational. Does it? It's sort of posing these questions. And the fact that we've got this repeated structure, does it? Again, possibly there's a reading of it that sees it as somehow confrontational. You know, think about this and think about these questions. Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Okay? This is a change. This is a change in the nature of the metaphors being presented. This is about fatigue. The dream loses its vitality, it sags. The dream kind of ages. That the dream sags like a heavy load, becomes simply a burden to shoulder. But there's a sense of a loss of dynamism and vitality. That the dream has become this sagging entity to lug around, this heavy load to carry. And then we've got very famous final line, separated out, single line stanza. The final word of this poem is explode. And the line itself almost acts like an explosion. You know, it sort of detonates at the end of the poem. we've got these, we've got this image of desiccation, we've got this image of decay and, disgusting imagery, and then we've got this tired, kind of weary moment, maybe it just sags like a heavy load, and then, this explosion, or does it explode? And lots of ways of thinking about that, this idea of the dream detonating, and interesting, the title being Harlem. It's often read, and I think it is a perfectly worthwhile reading, that we're thinking here then about the notion of an explosion. What does an exploding dream look like? And one way, it looks like violence. It looks like rioting. And this hints at what we might consider to be, that explosion of the dream that's unrealised, that's been deferred, that's held back, that isn't realised. That, the explosion is that moment of catharsis, that kind of rage at deferred desire, deferred dreams, that moment of catharsis, which can take its form, in expressions of a kind of political violence, possibly through rioting. It's interesting to think about this because Martin Luther King described rioting as the language of the unheard. Which he got quite a bit of stick for that at the time, for being seen to condone rioting. And I have to say it's not a quotation from Martin Luther King that many people like to re-quote and re-mention because it's quite a challenging idea. I mean, basically suggesting that this explosion of the dream is, through we're going to take the explosion at the end of this poem as a kind of relating in some way to rioting, as politically valid in some sense. And often rioting is described as sort of senseless, a waste of time, done just purely for the sake of it. And what Martin Luther King is saying is actually rioting is a way of people who haven't been heard, black people in America, possibly, whose dreams have been continuously deferred because of being treated like second-class citizens after supposed emancipation from slavery. That this explosion is there, is sort of latent, okay? And that's also, does it explode? There's a sense in which it can't be resisted. That you can only defer people's dreams for so long, and that it simply takes a particular spark to ignite and cause an explosion. So these things can happen to the dream, okay? But perhaps most challengingly, so too can this, an explosion. The dream can detonate, can explode, okay? With all of the connotations of violence that are associated. And I think, the George Floyd moment, the killing of that, the murder of that black man in America being knelt on, okay, and that I can't breathe, horror of that moment, connects, I think, extremely well and closely with this poem. The dream of an America free of police brutality, of racialized police brutality. That's many people's dream, and it hasn't been realised. It's been a dream continuously deferred, and what's happened? Well, these things potentially have happened over time, and this has happened in recent weeks and months. This kind of explosion, this moment of kind of violent catharsis. So there are lots and lots of ways of engaging with this poem. It's about a very specific historical moment. This was written in 1951, and it's about the problems and the horrible racism the black community in America were facing. But at the same time, one of the joys of this poem is that because of its sort of specific historical moment, it also speaks to historical moments beyond itself, such as our own. Reading this poem, it was 1951. we're reading this in 2020, and it still speaks to us. So, very, very interesting in terms of the metaphors being used, endlessly sort of unpickable and responds brilliantly to analysis. But what I wanted in this video today was just to give you a sort of short introduction to it, get you thinking about this poem, and get you reflecting on both its language and also, obviously, through that language, its broader meanings.